Hello, and welcome to another Climate Tech podcast, conversations with the people trying to save us from ourselves. In this episode, I talked with Carlota Ochoa Nevin Dumont, climate tech investor at Extantia. I reached Carlota in London to discuss investing in gigacorns, which are companies that can offset or prevent a gigaton of carbon release each year, which industries can have the biggest impact in carbon reduction, and why many bankers are getting into climate tech. I'm Ryan Grant Little. Thanks for being here. Carlota, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you here.
Great to be on the podcast. Thank you so much, Ryan.
So I'm fascinated because I know a lot of people in the climate tech space these days, whether they're entrepreneurs, investors, a lot of them seem to have a banking background. Can you go back a little bit? How did you get into banking and how did you make the transition up into today as a climate tech investor?
Yeah, sure. So I think my pathway into banking wasn't necessarily intentional. I won together with some students in my undergrad. We won a stock picking competition, which got me an internship into Merrill Lynch. Hadn't really foreseen that, but then spent a summer on the trading floor and got pretty excited by what I saw. So joined Merrill Lynch in the sales and trading scheme out of university into the commodity space because I thought that I kind of liked the fact of having something tangible to work with. Did that for about 3 years with a focus on European energy, and through that kind of had exposure to the early versions of today's carbon markets. It was a really interesting sector, but I think like many of my fellow former bankers, didn't really enjoy the atmosphere, the lifestyle, and everything else that come kind of with working at an investment bank, and then left to the much sexier startup scene. Joined an early stage startup, and that was a fantastic experience through kind of the pre-seed stages. But we ultimately failed. And then I kind of was left thinking with what I want to do with my life, where I want to go. And then thought kind of like, I think as a lot of people come to that conclusion, that venture is that really kind of nice intersection between finance and startups. Did an MBA. Throughout my MBA, kind of started getting a little bit in the background anxious about what was going on with our climate. But kind of, I think it was at that stage, it was a little bit too early. You didn't really have this second round of climate tech 2.0 funds that I would say. So initially joined doing my MBA, a B2B SaaS fund, and started in the background kind of to advise other funds and founders on their strategies around commercialization pathways, using carbon markets in climate tech. And that's how I kind of initially met the Extantia guys, who at the time were kind of operating a small fund. So after my MBA, after doing kind of a little bit of other work, COVID happened. So I pivoted into Amazon for a very short period of time, but kind of was in the background advising on climate tech with Extantia. Joined them as a venture partner. And then when they decided to raise their second kind of large institutional round, I joined them full time.
Okay, and so who is Extantia? Who's behind it? What are the focuses of it? And what's when you say it's a bigger institutional round, how big is that?
It's a decarbonization fund with a mission to back technologies that can that are solving gigaton emissions problems. The meaning of Extantia is extant, which is kind of refers to a state of existing and rising above, which is probably best understood in the context of its antonym, which is extinct, which kind of to some extent defines our underlying mission, which is to invest in companies that solve gigaton emissions problems and help us as humanity to continue thriving, as opposed to creating the conditions of our own extinctions. Basically, initially, we tested the market with a smaller fund to try to understand, well, are there enough interesting companies that are importantly investable from a VC point of view, where kind of the tech has been de-risked to some extent, so that you can really kind of commercialize and scale up these technologies within your typical 10-year fund life cycle. Tested that through the kind of the first vehicle, and then which led to the flagship fund, which is what we're investing out of now. That is a vehicle where we haven't done our final close yet, but that we're aiming that to be a kind of 150 million vehicle. And we also have a fund of funds and kind of out of which we're investing. So overall, we're kind of building this 300 million investment platform for early stage climate tech.
It's such a great name and a great story that goes with it. So so it's about decarbonization. What size deals are you doing? What geography, types of companies? Is that kind of broad, or do you have a pretty specific thesis on that?
So in terms of geography, it's Europe plus now the UK and Israel, just because that's where we're based. We tend to prefer to lead an investment fund. We want to be involved with our portfolio companies. And if we're kind of very far removed locationally wise, we find that difficult. So we can consider other geographies, but the focus is very much kind of Europe, the UK and Israel. And other than that, really, it has to be early stage. So seed and Series A is our sweet spot. And really, our mandate is to invest into gigaton emissions problems. So the first question, as long as kind of the stage and the geography is right, the question that we ask ourselves is this a gigaton emissions problem? Can we attribute to that specific company in the long run emissions reductions of at least 100 megatons per annum, which is huge, right? We currently pollute about 52 gigatons per annum. So if the answer to that is yes, then we're really excited. And then in terms of sector, it's obviously we're more interested kind of in the more underfunded sectors of climate tech, which I think where there's a larger opportunity set because there's a larger, I guess, market for the taking. We kind of also invest at the stage where the technology has been largely de-risked. And we prefer taking kind of scaling and engineering risk as opposed to fundamental technology risk, which is difficult to find at the early stages in deep tech. So a lot of what we invest into are spin-outs out of universities or founders who have otherwise been able to get significant amount of grant funding to fund the underlying research and are now at the stage where they can actually go start building demo plans, getting first contact with customers and really start scaling. That's really ideally where we like to come in.
Fascinating. And so what are these underserved industries or less visible industries that have that possibility? I'm thinking, is that food, mobility, construction, these types of things?
Yes. So I think to set the context, what I mean with underfunding, right? So I think if I remember the figures to be correct, I think it's something like in the 2021 we had kind of the sectors that are responsible for kind of 85% of the emissions only get about 40% of the investments. Uh-huh. That I think that gap has been narrowing, right? But funders that are sectors that are very kind of overfunded relative to the size of the emission problems is generally energy, transport, and mobility. And sectors that are relatively underfunded is carbon removals, food, agriculture, in industry in general. I mean, all of these sectors could use more funding, right? But I'm just talking kind of on a relative basis. Although also within the energy space, there are things that are also relatively underfunded, such as like generation of baseload of renewable baseload electricity. So that's why we like geothermal a lot. There's also, I think, there's a lot of work to be done on the grid and really expanding the capacities of our grids. We're currently trying to electrify everything yet, and we kind of expected increase in demand on grid resources is going to rise by 50% over the next decade. There's no chance it's going to happen without some fundamental investments happening both on managing these grids on a software level, but also in terms of hard wires into the ground.
Yeah, transmission, distribution, all these things are
exactly.
Issues. And I think, as a society, we still expect just that you plug something in and everything works. And there's a lot, needless to say, that underlies this. And I ran a biogas company in the mid 2000s. And one of the best things about it is that it's baseload, and most renewable energy, whether it's wind or solar, doesn't have kind of that advantage. And it's kind of the wind blows when it blows and the sun shines when it shines, and being able to kind of find these ways to provide baseload or to control when the energy is produced is really fundamental and a big challenge that we're facing.
Exactly. So that I think whilst there's lots of investments going into energy overall, these sectors, I think, still require more funding and present really interesting investment opportunities.
Also in food, I mean, there was a report a little while ago that I keep citing, and I keep forgetting if it's BCG or Bain that did this together with The Guardian, but one of the two that basically said that the carbon impact, of every dollar, euro, whatever invested in the food industry or in food tech from a carbon perspective, food is so much better than mobility or built environment in terms of the attribution or the impact that comes out of that. I think people are surprised to hear about that. And, we know kind of instinctively, or there's a lot of talk about, what a hamburger looks like compared to a flight or something. But the third rail, or the people get really excited about Teslas and these kinds of things. But a lot of times it's things that are really fundamental and kind of, a little less sexy, like the food industry, where, I'm saying this as an investor in 27 alternative proteins companies. So, I've drunk the Kool-Aid on it, obviously, but I'm glad to hear that this thesis is also about like looking at kind of some of these underserved industries that aren't always looked at as necessarily climate tech, right? A lot of people don't think of food as climate tech.
Well, I think exactly, but I think there's also kind of a change in thinking happening at the moment, whereas like climate tech is generally probably not the best description for our field, because it's like it's climate tech is starting to become everything that we do. Everything that we do emits CO2 because we're based on a kind of carbon-based economy, right? So what I think, whereas this field is going, in 5 years' time, no one's going to be talking about climate tech. It's just going to be tech, because really everything that we do as humanity has a climate or angle, because most of the things that we currently do pollute. So yeah, it encompasses everything.
I'm just launching this podcast, and so does that mean I already have to change the name? Give me a couple of years.
No. I mean, we call ourselves we're a climate tech fund, right? But I think it's similar to kind of the .com funds of the early
exactly.
2000s, right? They're no longer .com funds; they're now just tech funds.
No one calls themselves an internet company anymore, really, right?
Exactly, and the ones that do, I do see that sometimes in a pitch deck, and it raises a few eyebrows.
Yeah, and so I mean, you've been involved in carbon from the market side for a long time. Carbon is, I mean, every time in this sector, it's everywhere, right? And especially with all these net zero goals from cities and corporates, it's attracting a lot of attention. What's happening in the carbon markets? Can you just give maybe a little overview of kind of what is the carbon market right now? What's the price of carbon? What does the outlook look like?
I mean, so I think it's not the easiest question to answer, because what we try to do in general, we try not to look at kind of short-term fluctuation in the prices of the assets. Obviously, the price of carbon is a super important part of our investment thesis, right? Because we believe that we are starting to put a price on carbon, either through taxes, through tariffs, or cap and trade systems, and now increasingly through voluntary carbon markets, through stakeholder pressures that we believe, or I believe, have a fairly high chance of becoming mandated in the next decade or so. So I think where we're going is that every corporate, at least in the developed world, is going to have an internalized price of carbon, depending on the different regimes and the jurisdictions that they're working. Now, in mandated carbon markets, so for example, the EU ETS, the prices have been rising significantly. I think, don't quote me on the number, but I think we're just under kind of 100 euros a ton now. And the reason that is because the system is fundamentally designed to curb the supply of these credits as we approach net zero. And now, on the other hand, you have the voluntary carbon markets, where there is no price as such, because it's all over the counter and really kind of depends on the quality of the different credits. So you can get a removal ton can fetch a price north of $500, whereas some kind of nature-based, in parentheses, low quality credit may be in the single digits, right? So there's a huge variety in prices. Now, what we believe is that there is, as the different tools are built to really kind of understand the risk associated with all of these different projects and the likelihood that a credit will actually result in a ton of removal, that's going to create pricing signals. So the higher quality credits will fetch a premium relatively to the lower quality of credit. So one of the investments that we've made is into BeZero. They do just that. They're a carbon ratings agency, and they help to kind of they help their customers to understand the risk profile and the quality of their credits, so that they can then have to give them that price signaling. So yes, I think we will continue to see a flight towards quality. Carbon removals credits now are fetching really, really high prices because they're generally considered to be the higher quality projects. But yeah, it just depends a lot on a project by project basis.
So I think that's interesting.
Sorry, I could ramble on about this.
But it's interesting. I mean, I understand the underlying point, which is that you don't really need to look at the day-to-day prices or kind of understand it, minute to minute. You just take it as a given that there is going to be a mandated price, and voluntary is going to possibly shift to kind of mandated over time. And so anything that your investees are doing to remove carbon, this is going to be priced in more and more as those companies grow and as time passes.
Exactly. And I just think that kind of at these really expensive levels of carbon removal credits, which are kind of the highest quality ones, $500 a ton plus, there's a limited market, right? Because it becomes much cheaper to actually do the mitigation in your supply chain, as opposed to purchase these credits, except for the kind of the really, really difficult to abate sectors. So I think there's going to be a market for that, for things that are very difficult to decarbonize in the supply chains and the action of companies. But as the prices of these removal credits come down, as different CDR technologies mature, that market is going to start increasing, where companies might actually, so you're just looking at the marginal cost of abatement, right? Is it cheaper for me to decarbonize my operations, or do I just purchase these high quality removal credits? And that's where the market will find its equilibrium.
Interesting, and I think it's a very good bet also to be investing in a ratings agency. We're seeing all kinds of stories about large companies, airlines that have offset programs, and one day it turns out that the accounting shows up that these are actually worthless credits, or people are paying into at the gas pump or on a flight, they're paying into kind of CO2 compensation that ends up not basically doing what it's supposed to do, and potentially just landing in the pockets of the companies.
Exactly, right. So it's really kind of about understanding, and most of these corporates, right, they just don't understand the quality of exactly. Yeah. And now, you may have seen, there was like kind of this damning series of articles in The Guardian claiming that all of these credits are worthless. This is all greenwashing, which is, in my opinion, one of the most unhelpful pieces of journalistic work that has set the entire market, which is doing something great, back by a couple of years by just kind of destroying buyer confidence. But we're just kind of, I think, but the tools are being built by companies such as BeZero to help kind of us navigate, to help corporates navigate their environment and understand the quality of the assets that they're purchasing.
So speaking of terms like mandated, I've seen in some of the pieces that you've written or posts that you've written, you talk about the need for public policy to step in and help to develop some of the climate tech solutions out there. So why aren't the markets alone up to this challenge?
I think, well, it's got to do with part of the things. I mean, I studied economics, so I fundamentally believe in the power of free markets, but I'm also kind of very aware of its shortcomings. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of the tragedy of the commons.
Yes, so right? This is where you have cows overgrazing the grass that's available for all the cows to graze.
Exactly. So it's kind of an idea where individuals within a group make rational decisions between themselves in the short term, which ultimately ends up to the depletion of a common resource, causing harm to everybody else involved. And really what's happening kind of with global warming, that's kind of a prime example of that phenomenon on a global scale. The reason why that happens is because free markets are not perfect, and they're very bad at doing a number of things, and most importantly, kind of pricing negative externalities, right? As in, and the emissions is a perfect example of a negative externality that isn't correctly priced, because number of agents do interactions that pollute, yet that the cost of that pollution isn't internalized in the cost of the transaction that those two peoples make between themselves. So this is kind of a clear shortcoming of the free market, and where governments can really help with as long as it's good thought out policies, and internalizing the cost of that externality, i.e. putting a price on carbon through, be it cap and trade systems, through tariffs, through taxes. I think this is absolutely somewhere where governments can intervene. The other thing that free markets kind of assume that everybody is rational, and people aren't necessarily perfectly rational. We have a lot of kind of hyperbolic discounting, where people, for example, if you have to spend money today for a larger saving at some point in the future, you're not necessarily going to make that decision, because you just really discount that future benefit so much more relative to your current expense. And what that means is that, for example, people don't invest into heat pumps, into solar panels, just because it's an upfront expense that gives you a benefit later on. So this is another thing I think where government policy can come in to kind of subsidize customers and consumers in helping them buy these products, making really attractive finance available to kind of overcome this hyperbolic discounting problem. And I think then maybe final is the final one is we have a timing issue, right? As in, we don't have a lot of time to fix the planet. So if we just let the free market do its thing, then the best technologies kind of will survive. Lots of them will fail in the progress, but I don't think we have that. I don't think we have that luxury. So really, we need to finance as much of these solutions as possible and get them kind of through the funding valley of death, which is where a lot of startups fail. And this is specifically difficult in climate tech, because at the end, CO2 is a molecule. So we need hardware solution that big plants, big CapEx projects that can often kind of fail in that process of building their first plants, because early stage venture capital investors don't necessarily have kind of the amount of funding required, and don't want to fund with equity multiple 100 million plants, as in when it comes, for example, for DAC, right? Or building massive arc furnaces for a decarbonized way to make cement, or for steel manufacturing, right? And at the same time, your traditional debt players or infrastructure financing players don't necessarily want to take the risk of financing such a large plant when it's a first of a kind and the technology hasn't been proven. So I think there is really a need for governments there to step in and provide grants and provide match funding for these companies, so to enable as many as possible of them to get through the funding valley of death, so that we can commercialize and try to commercialize as much of these technologies.
I couldn't agree more. So as we're talking right now, it's a week before the official beginning of summer. And if the summer is going to be anything like the winter was, where we saw, basically heat waves, records were set of, 4.5 degrees, and records should usually be set by about 0.5 degrees. So if the same thing happens in the summer, we're going to be really facing quite a crisis. I mean, as we're talking now, the skies in New York City are orange from wildfires coming down from Canada. Do you think this is the summer that people finally wake up and this stuff hits home, or is it going to be business as usual?
I mean, I think it depends. I don't know whether patterns are going to be this summer, but I think everyone generally has their moments when they realize I don't know if it's going to be the summer, right? But I often have conversations where people are like, oh, it's so warm, and it's like bittersweet, because they can't wait. They're like, okay, it's early June and it's really warm, which is fantastic. But at the same time, it's like, it just makes the problem so much more front of mind. So I think attitudes are shifting, and they're realizing that it's not necessarily always a good thing.
I remember when seeing Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth in the cinema and thinking, okay, this is going to be the moment. When was that? The mid 2000s, the aughts, thinking this is going to be the moment that people really get it. And still, I mean, there was a kind of a blip then, and things kind of reverted back to the mean after that. But hopefully some of these things that finally, are hitting home in developed countries and on people's doorsteps, a lot of the people who control the money are making these decisions. My hope is that that this finally kind of, the roosters have come home, or the birds have
come home to hatch. I don't know.
Something's come home.
Someone's come home to hatch. Yeah, exactly. No, I definitely, maybe I live in a bit of a bubble. I definitely think that the rooster has come home to hatch or whatever it is. And it is so front of mind in every conversations that I have, from whether it be personal, business, on every level, which kind of also makes me a little bit more optimistic about the future.
Someone's going to send an email with what that correct expression is.
Yes.
Something, the hens will come home to roost. I don't know, something like that.
Something will galvanize the comments.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Let's do it that way. Okay. The hardest question now: who is your hero?
Who?
It's hard, right? It's harder than talking about carbon markets and predictions about carbon markets.
It is. Maybe to tie it in with a point that we just made, right? I think there's a number of things that are happening that are getting people. I think it's super important to get people galvanized. The one thing that's currently already getting people galvanized is the fact that now there's shareholder and government pressure to get to net zero, and it now makes commercial sense. It now makes commercial sense to get net zero because of carbon's getting priced in, green premia are coming down, and that's getting a lot of people, entrepreneurs, people with commercial mindsets into climate tech, which we ultimately need. But then there's these kind of other angle that we need people to firstly be optimistic about the road ahead. And we need to get the new generation, new policymakers coming in, new people kind of working on different ideas to come into the space, and think of exciting pathways to decarbonize. And I think probably the two people who I would say are kind of a little bit of my heroes who have done the most on this, so I'm going to say two people, is here in the UK, David Attenborough, who has, with his whole kind of, I think, with his documentaries, that I don't know how it is where you live, but here in the UK, it's just like everybody watches his documentaries, right?
Everybody recognizes his voice, for sure.
Everybody recognizes his voice. And I think he's had the effect that Al Gore wanted to have with An Inconvenient Truth, by kind of really appealing to people's hearts with what's happening in the animal world. So I think he's a little bit of a personal hero. And then I think the other personal hero is probably Greta Thunberg. You may agree or disagree with the message or the method, the message and the method, as a lot of people I think kind of do, but I think it's so impressive how a young teenage girl can drive such a large message on a global scale, and the guts with which she has done that, and obviously rubbing a lot of people in the wrong way is also. It takes a lot of courage, so I think that's a little bit of a hero.
Those are two very solid picks. Carlotta, thanks a lot for joining. This has been really interesting.
No worries, it was a pleasure. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks for listening to another Climate Tech podcast. Please take 5 seconds to send this episode link to a colleague or friend who you think might be interested. Reach out to me anytime at hello@climatetechpod.com. As you can probably tell, this episode was produced, edited, directed, stage managed, boom operated, and everything else by me. Subscribe to hear many more conversations still to come with the world's real climate tech heroes.